Thank you all. We're up to our final presenter. I was invited to speak at a conference in Japan, and there was a small dinner of people giving the keynote addresses, and I was feeling pretty good about myself because these are people whose names you would know. And I started to talk to them at this dinner, and I said, well, you know, I was talking to Andy Krepinevich, and they stopped me cold. You know Dr. Krepinevich? And the rest of the 20-minute discussion was entirely about his work. So that's the sort of person you have coming up next. Distinguished people have been looking at his work for quite some time. There are not many people who can say they changed the way that the American military thinks about what they're doing. He's done it more than once. Andy Marshall, who's one of the great defense intellectuals, chose Andrew to work on a book about Andy Marshall. So there are not many higher accolades I can give to a thinker than that Andy Marshall has found him consistently interesting over the years. He served 21 years in the military, in the Army. He served, after that, 21 years as president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Affairs. He's been at Hudson now as a senior fellow for a couple years, which I think means you owe us 19 years, if my math is correct. He's on the Chief of Naval Operations executive panel. I could go down a much longer list, but we're getting late, so let me turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Scooter, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to wander around, and I'm probably going to end up over here because I've got a slide deck, and it requires some explanation. Hopefully, everybody can see the board here. If not, hopefully you can reference the board over there. And a bit of background. First of all, this is looking at the South China Sea from a military planner's perspective. And the sort of the origins of this came a couple of years ago. And there was a general recognition, I think, that at least in military terms, the United States faced a strategic choice in the Western Pacific. The Chinese military buildup was in its second decade. The military balance in the region was starting to shift. Along what China calls the first island chain, we had security commitments to Japan, the Philippines, and implied security commitment to Taiwan. We also, as I think Arthur alluded to, or maybe it was Ashley, a long-standing vital interest in preventing the emergence of a hostile hegemonic power, either in Europe or in the Far East. Fought the Second World War and the Cold War to prevent that from happening. And finally, we had a strong stake in the preservation of the rules-based international order to prevent changes in the system that arrive out of a consequence of coercion or intimidation. And so the question came, the strategic choice is, how do we maintain a stable military balance in the face of Chinese military activities, the military buildup and so on? And obviously we had the alliance commitments, the security commitments, and we have this defense program. We're buying planes and tanks and ships and so on and so forth. We're positioning them around the world. But the gap between what you're trying to accomplish, which is to preserve a stable military balance, and the stuff that you're buying and where you're positioning it and the balance and the mix of these capabilities, that really doesn't tell you how you're going to address this problem of the stable military balance. And in military terms, what you need is an operational concept. It's the thing that links the stuff to the objective. And it tells you how you're going to position your forces, how you're going to operate, what you're going to ask your allies and partners to do. And essentially, that's what archipelagic defense is about. And so a little bit of background here in terms of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk pretty quickly, first because it's late in the day. It's been a long day. I know that I'm the last man up here, but I take consolation in the fact that I'm the only thing standing between you and the rush hour. So nobody's going anywhere too fast. So basically looking at the character of the problem that the U.S. military sees itself confronting, archipelagic defense, which is a way of addressing the problem, and then some insights and observations that come out of it. A lot of uncertainty about risks. This is the sip of water through a fire hose. So this is the fast and furious presentation you're going to get today. A little bit of background. Began with a Defense Department summer study in 2014. Congressman Thornberry, the House chairman, and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs, also wrote a separate piece focusing totally on the issue of archipelagic defense as it relates to China. That led to some trips to Japan, where they sponsored this monograph on archipelagic defense. And I think you can begin to see some of this emerging in the recent release of the National Defense Strategy, which basically admits that we're back in great power competition, and the principal competitor for the United States as a great power is China. Also, some key contributors to the effort. If you like it, it's probably has to do with a lot of what these people contributed. If you don't like it, it's probably because the guy up here couldn't get it straight. But very grateful to a number of my Japanese colleagues, and obviously to my American colleagues as well. So what's the character of the challenge? Christopher Ford, I think, put it well in his book, and he said, you know, if you're China, history says you're either up or you're down. Either you're the Middle Kingdom and people are paying respect to you, or you're in your century of humiliation. The fundamental illegitimacy of truly separate and independent state sovereignties. And again, there's this notion that the shifting of the military balance and the attempt to dominate that part of the region coming into, that part of the world, excuse me, coming into clash with longstanding U.S. interests and the freedom of independence of our allies and partners. The famous Singaporean Lee Kuan Yew, I love this comment. The Chinese expect Singaporeans to be more respectful of China as it becomes more influential. They tell us that countries big or small are equal. We're not a hegemon. But when we do something they don't like, they say, you have made 1.3 billion people unhappy, so please know your place. And so do you want a rules-based international order that exists today, or the rules-based international order that might succeed it if China has its say in that part of the world? I'm sure you're familiar today with the first and the second island chain. They're terms that, as far as I know, were developed by the Chinese. And of course, as I mentioned before, we have alliances with Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, security commitment to Taiwan, and important security relationships with other countries in the region. So a long-standing, strong stake in the security and the prosperity of that part of the world. What we've seen in terms of the South China Sea is the development of Chinese outposts in this part of the world. And I agree with, I arrived during Ashley's presentation, agree with what Arthur had to say, but I'll start to develop a theme and I'll extend it through the presentation, which is this gives the Chinese not only access to important economic resources, as Arthur was saying, but it also, if you look at it as a game of Go, which is the East Asian version of chess, Wei Qi, placing stones on the board, it's not about capturing pieces, it's about positional advantage, putting your rival in such a position that essentially there's no good options for them. It gets back to Sun Tzu's comment that you know, the greatest act of generalship is not winning through war, it's winning without war. And if you look at these pieces here and you look at it from a strategic planner's perspective, a military planner's perspective, you can see that what we lose as they move down in this direction is strategic depth. We lose the ability to be able to retreat or reconstitute because of the advance of military capability in this area. And so one important question is, what do we do about that from a military perspective, not in addition to an economic perspective? So we're losing positional advantage. And this essentially goes for the competition in the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if Ashley mentioned it during his presentation, but the Chinese are doing a very good job of placing stones in other parts of the world. Okay, let's see, there we go. And the way they're doing this, the Pentagon term for it is anti-access area denial, but essentially the Chinese are developing a range of capabilities that are essentially designed to go after the US military's muscle and its nervous system. So the muscle is at a fairly few bases We have Okinawa down here in Kadena. We have some bases, air and naval, in Japan, a few in South Korea. Chinese, we have the INF treaty that precludes us from building intermediate range ballistic missiles. The Chinese are building them like sausages. They're becoming increasingly accurate, and we have very modest means of being able to defend against a ballistic missile attack. Same thing with cruise missiles. So we have a lot of eggs in a very few baskets, including our carriers. Chinese developing the DF-21 anti-ship ballistic missile, DF-26. And if you look at, so that's the muscle aspect of it. If you look at the nervous system, the development of anti-satellite capabilities. We use satellites to be able to inform the movement of our forces, to guide our precision-guided munitions, to maintain the coherency of our military formations. Obviously, the Chinese are also in cyber warfare in a big way. And most of our logistics networks, by the way, are not on secure networks. And there's an old military saying that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. So if you want to look at it as kind of a weather front moving through the area, and the military balance is the isobar. The isobar, the way the Chinese look at it, has been pushing further and further out from their shores. And again, think of winning without fighting. You know, the idea isn't to go to war with Japan or the Philippines or anyone else. The idea is to win without fighting. And the question is how, and of course, when you win without fighting, then you begin to dictate the terms of what the rules are for this part of the world. And so again, it gets you back to the strategic choice. So why archipelagic defense? Again, we have a very vital interest, longstanding commitments. It's a stressful case. China is the pacing challenge to our security in this area. And the bottom line is that current trends say that unless we begin to take offsetting actions to maintain a stable military balance, that balance will become increasingly unfavorable and unstable. Okay, when we think about how to address this from a military perspective, we have to think about, as Ashley said, not just what our problems are, but what worries China. Because if things worry China enough, perhaps they'll be dissuaded or discouraged or deterred from engaging in acts of coercion or, you certainly not want them to engage in acts of war to resolve or to achieve their own security interests. For them to conduct offensive operations, if you read the PLA, the People Liberation Army documents and their doctrine, air superiority, sea control, and information superiority provides the bubble under which they can project ground forces and other kinds of forces out along the first island chain. They're also concerned about their coastal assets. A lot of their economy resides along the coast, so those are targets that are potentially vulnerable. They're using strategic depth to try and protect their assets. They're concerned about our long-range precision strike capability because it can potentially deny them that depth. And they're also concerned about a protracted conflict because the longer a war goes on, particularly in a society where they have to maintain tight control over the population, there's a concern about the CCP perhaps losing control over time. So Archipelagic Defense 1.0, I say 1.0 because this is really just the beginning of a discussion. There really is no comparable analog to this in terms of what the Defense Department is doing right now. But I have two Wei Chi sayings, which is look at the total number of pieces and the value of their mutually coordinated disposition. And this is why I've blown this up beyond consideration of just the South China Sea. This is why you have to look at the interlocking pieces. And again, one must have a complete strategy for the whole thing or should not even think about one part. And again, so this is the whole first island chain, the northern sector that runs through Japan, the southern sector that focuses on Taiwan and the Philippines. Okay, so first island chain from Singapore through Malaysia, Indonesia, all the way up through the Philippines, Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands, and Japan. That's the first island chain. Archipelagic Defense says we've got to figure out a way to develop military forces or capabilities that defend these areas along the first island chain. Pretty straightforward. The Japanese. Been working with the Japanese for about 30 years now. For most of those 30 years, they were trailing us. The Japanese, in the last 4 or 5 years, our allies have really gotten religion. We're in a situation now where we can learn from them. They're beginning, this is the southernmost island of Kyushu, they're beginning to establish their own blocking positions along the Ryukyu island chain as a way of telling the Chinese, this is our territory, we intend to defend it. They're also developing rapid reaction forces. I have a real debate with them over this because I think they have interesting capabilities, but they're probably thinking about them in the wrong way. But the idea is that they would have a rapid reaction force that in a crisis could reinforce one of these islands if it were threatened, or maybe several islands. And they are creating out of one brigade what we would refer to as a marine brigade, a brigade that's capable of regaining lost islands by amphibious attack. So these people are serious as a heart attack. They run exercises all on a frequent basis, and they're getting a lot more competent. It's very different Japanese ground self-defense force, Japanese self-defense force than I've seen, say, for most of the post-Cold War period. Another challenge that we face is this challenge of China's enduring advantage in terms of lines of communication. Another military term, but what it means is they operate along interior lines of communication where we operate along exterior lines. This means that all other things being equal, they can concentrate military power more quickly than we can. And if you can concentrate more quickly than the other guy, then you can get a military advantage and deterrence fails. So a big competition in this effort to maintain stability along the first island chain is to be able to compete effectively in the concentration, counter-concentration competition, to be able to counter-concentrate forces in ways that convince the Chinese that they cannot gain a military advantage anywhere along the first island chain. Okay, and the concept calls for this, to basically win the concentration, counter-concentration, use air and maritime forces, the most mobile forces, to be the counter-concentration force. They can move most quickly to counter-concentrate, and to rely on ground forces through Japan, which is what the Japanese are beginning to do, but also Taiwan and the Philippines, to enable those air and maritime forces to be liberated to form what a military would call an operational reserve. So you have carrier strike groups, the Marine Expeditionary Strike Groups, sort of the linebackers concentrating where they're needed along the first island chain in the event of a crisis. We also have the Americans, what some people call the prompt global strike capability, the long-range bombers, the B-2s, and so on, and also the possibility of positioning forces like the SSGN submarines with cruise missiles. As far as the ground forces go, this is a sort of a cutout of Japan. Obviously, it would extend down further, but we're looking at land-based sea denial, using land forces for long-range strike, land forces for alternative air and missile defenses, and land-based radio-electronic warfare. And you can see sort of these land-based bubbles here, mostly air defense and so on. Submarines out here, this is the maritime force that you could push out in front because they're hard to detect. And creating that kind of a barrier, that kind of a defensive line, again, for the purposes of maintaining a stable military balance. I'll just telescope in very quickly on land-based air denial. So you can have elevated sensors. This is the Army's JLINs, which, by the way, has been canceled. Long-range radars to pick up aircraft at a distance. Wide-range area integrated air and missile defenses. And then you have mobile air defenses, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and alternative ballistic missile defense systems. Some remarkable advances being made in directed energy, for example, recently. And as Arthur pointed out, this is an area where the Chinese are competing rather intensively as well. So again, putting these systems, the Japanese are already beginning to do this in part along the first island chain. And then behind that barrier, you have sanctuary areas for our airborne command and control tankers and so on that can enable our air component, our maritime component, to refuel their aircraft, to get situational awareness. And again, Japanese are beginning to do this in part. We're still kind of sucking our thumb on this. There's another issue about countering their strikes against our bases. And this is rather complicated. I'll save it if you have a question, but we need to defend a small number of fixed bases and carriers from potentially catastrophic attacks. This is a photo or a picture from a Chinese publication that shows their DF-21 anti-ship ballistic missiles coming in and basically taking out the American fleet. So they're serious about it. They're defending, and of course these are aircraft. I believe it's a Cadena. I'm not positive. These are aircraft that could be taken out, as well as the support facilities, through a ballistic missile attack as well. So what do? Some of the things that we should think about in terms of our defense program: increasing the range and stealth of our strike aircraft. This is something that the Pentagon's doing with its B-21 program. Hardening bases, make them hard and resilient so that it's more difficult for them to take out, for example, aircraft shelters. Dispersing aircraft to satellite bases. I talked to the senior Japanese planner for their Air Force. This is something that they've begun to do. They have a few military air bases in Japan. They have a lot of civilian air bases. And then basically taking out the enemy's ability to determine whether or not it was successful in an attack. So if you attack, say, a base and you can't tell, did I take the base out or didn't I, then you have to revisit the attack. It begins to drive up your cost. It begins to make it an unattractive proposition. So increasing the Chinese cost per shot, and that decreases their expected return for these kinds of attacks. Again, it's a bit more detailed than that, but I think you get the gist. Sea denial. This is ground forces in sea denial. Our Army doesn't have anti-ship cruise missiles. The Japanese are modernizing their already existing anti-ship cruise missile force. And so again, elevated sensors, this is for surface fleet, defined surface ships, unmanned ISR systems. So here they are out here in front of the first island chain. Joint partners also participate. Where's number 4 here? Here we go, over-the-horizon radars. The Chinese have these to look far out to sea. We can deploy them as well. And then offensive minefields, defensive minefields. One exercise I saw, the Japanese Ground Defense Force, they had this huge rack. It's like a huge grid or matrix of nothing but anti-ship mines. And they dump them in between, in these choke points. And as you know, it's sometimes can be fairly easy to clear a minefield if you don't have somebody around. They're hanging around. They're hanging around to make sure nobody messes with the minefields in these exercises. It can make it very difficult for the Chinese Navy to get out into the open sea. And then mobile anti-ship cruise missile barriers, basically to strike ships at sea that are, again, in the event of conflict. Finally, land-based electronic warfare. Electronic warfare is going to be a big part. Again, think about what the Chinese say they need to accomplish in order to conduct an offensive campaign: air superiority, sea control, and information dominance. Well, again, elevated communications nodes and electronic warfare platforms. These AESA radars can be used for electronic attack and jamming. We have ground-launched electronic attack weapons, including high-power microwave. This is the Boeing Champ system, for example. Mobile jammers. You can generate a lot more power from a system on land to generate jamming power. And then fiber optic communications for our own forces. Buried fiber optic communications all along this area here, much more resilient than trying to rely on satellites, for example. Okay, and then this is a bit speculative, more speculative than the other aspects, but this is a long-range strike. And as you may know, the INF Treaty, the only treaty that we signed with the Russians in 1987, right now we're the only country in the world that is observing this treaty. And the question is, why? But if you just look at the systems that we gave away over 30 years ago, Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles, if you position them in Kyushu, in Okinawa, and in Luzon here, you could hold an enormous number of targets at risk in China. These are targets that are essentially getting a free ride right now. because they can't be attacked properly, or we don't have sufficient capacity in our aging B-2s and B-52s and so on to go after them. So they don't have to worry about defending these systems. They don't have to worry about hardening these systems. They get to sit there for free. And that's a very obvious disadvantage we have, one that we could correct over time, depending upon whether we or our allies begin to take action to field these kinds of systems. And then China, Wei Qi, and positional advantage. Okay, here's the stones on the board. I wanted to come back to the South China Sea to put sort of archipelagic defense in context. So here's one picture. I'm sure you've seen enough photographs of this today and charts. And now, when we did the work on archipelagic defense, I have to be careful what I say here. I talked to a friend of mine who's on Japan's National Security Council staff, and he said, well, these bubbles, these are the ground force bubbles, if you will, but they're also backed by air forces and so on. These are the bubbles that have air defense, missile defense, jamming, anti-ship cruise missiles, and so on. He said, we're taking care of the northern sector. He said, you guys need to take care of the southern sector. You guys need to get into the Philippines, get into Luzon. Palawan is down here. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular area, but it sits right there on the front step of what the Chinese are trying to do. And I don't know if Ashley mentioned it in his presentation, but there is some conversation between the Indians and the Vietnamese, between the Japanese and the Vietnamese. Indians and Vietnamese have been using Russian equipment for a long time, so that may be the easy pathway. But they develop similar capabilities here, basically air denial, sea denial, coastal defense, these sorts of things. And what you're doing is you're placing stones on either side. And this basically puts the Japanese, and they used to have the old westerns where you never tell the cavalry to go in the canyon. This becomes a canyon. They have lost their advantage, at least in that respect. Doesn't solve the economic problem that Arthur mentioned, but it certainly creates a new military situation. Some stones in very good positions. Down here in Singapore is also another spot. So restoring positional advantage. This is sort of a summary. Again, you see these are Taiwanese forces. These are, these are American forces. Japanese forces, the Americans down here. This is sort of the barrier. This is the operational reserve, the counter-concentration force, the long-range strategic reinforcement force. And of course, I haven't mentioned a number of our allies, like the Filipinos, like the Taiwanese, like the Australians, but they have important roles to play as well. Be glad to try and address those. Some insights and observations. People have said to me, God, this looks very ambitious. How are you going to do it? Of course, the great Jimmy Dugan in the movie A Field of Our Own, when one of his players wanted to quit because it was too hard, he said, it's supposed to be hard. If it was hard, everybody could do it. It's the hard that makes it great. So this is important enough, and it's hard enough that we should be called to greatness and actually get something done here. Sources of positional advantage, Japan and the Philippines, these are the two linchpins. It's very hard to say we're going to defend the first island chain. Fortunately, these countries are our allies. As was mentioned, unfortunately, Duterte is the guy running the Philippines. Taiwan and Vietnam, highly desirable. These countries, obviously, as Arthur was talking about, the bottle and the cork and so on. Game changer, India. India could really be a game changer. Think about the big board, the Wei Qi board. It's the Indo-Pacific. When I met with Secretary Mattis to talk about these kinds of issues, one of the two issues he wanted to talk about is what about India? And fortunately, our Japanese and Australian friends are doing a great job cultivating a stronger relationship with India along with the United States. Paying the bill, how are you going to pay for this? And first of all, this doesn't happen overnight. Think of NATO in 1949, when we were just getting our act together, and NATO in 1962. So unfortunately, it can't happen overnight. But what you want to do is begin to reverse the negative trend and maintain stability and enhance stability. So the funds for this will be stretched out over a considerable amount of time. Enhanced efficiencies. I was talking to my friend, former Deputy Secretary Work. He said, we've been spending too much of our time and resources and energy on shaping. We have to get back to warfighting to convince people that we actually know how to do our business. And that's, I think, one reason why we've had ships bump in the night too often lately, because we've been spending too much time just being out there, as opposed to when we go out there, we're damn ready to do dirty business if we have to. It's an operational concept. Right now, what you have is about $700 billion that's being spent on what the Pentagon calls program momentum. It's there because it's been there. It's not there because we figured out how we want to use it to maintain stability. So there are efficiencies to be gained, not management efficiencies that we never really end up seeing, but true efficiencies. Terminate the BCA. This is sort of everybody's, you wave the flag. Stop the idiocy with the Budget Control Act and with sequestration and with continuing resolutions. You're going to have to take on increased risk. So, strategies about apportioning risk. I think we can do certain things with the Korea commitment that we have, particularly with the large commitment of ground brigade combat teams. When you talk about these ground forces that do air defense, missile defense, coastal defense, and so on, we can reconfigure some of these forces and actually do a better job of reinforcing the Philippines. If you look at the new national defense strategy, I don't think it's out there in bold letters, but I think PACOM has top priority relative to CENTCOM, which kind of the magnet for resources because of the unpleasantness since 9/11, and also EUCOM. We can also do some outsourcing with our allies and partners. I'm more familiar with the Japanese, but time and time again, they've said, basically, how are we supposed to go about doing our business? If we know how we're going to do this, what the operational concept is, we know the division of labor, then we can begin to decide, what we're going to do and optimize our resources to do it. Enhanced positional advantage, I talked about that. Some cost-imposing strategies. Again, long-range stealthy strike and scout platforms, that denies the Chinese, for example, strategic depth. The missile artillery does the same. Missile sinks, glad to talk about that if you want. Advanced irregular warfare forces. We talked about this and focused on this for Taiwan and for the Philippines. And let me just give the Philippines as an example. They don't have the resources to be able to field these high-end systems right now. What they do have the resources to be able to do with our cooperation and assistance is to create kind of a really nasty Hezbollah kind of force. An irregular force that is armed with guided rockets and artillery and mortars, backed up by air power like the Northern Alliance was in Afghanistan back in 2001, working with our Rangers, our special forces. Economic warfare, this is something that Arthur alluded to. Looking at blockade, how would we run a blockade? And it had to be a distant blockade. It had to be down there where he talked about the cork in the bottle around Singapore. As he also pointed out, there's some real economic pressure we can bring to bear or threaten to bring to bear if China wants to choose the path of war instead of operating through internationally recognized norms of behavior. And then finally, augmented defense resources. The United States in the Cold War spent about 6.4% of its GDP on average on defense. Back in around 2010, it was 4.1%. Now we're at about 3%, going down to 2.6%, okay? Now that's not the only measure, that's not the only metric. But I would say when you look at China and you look at its GDP, Russia's GDP maxed out at about 40% of ours during the Cold War. China's is at 60% of ours, which is 50% greater, and it's growing faster than ours. To say that it isn't a much bigger challenge, demanding maybe not 6.4%, but certainly not 2.6%, I think is a reasonable assumption to make. So conclusion, the Chinese are developing capabilities designed to basically push us out of the area. They certainly are the leading challenger. Archipelagic defense is designed to say, okay, what are we going to do about it? If we've decided that China's a competitor, the administration has said so, what are we going to do to maintain stability in that part of the world? Because cooperation, we hope for it, but competition seems to be what we're getting. And so that and the fact that we're not going to likely be able to buy our way out of our mistakes indicates that we ought to start to get serious about this sort of issue right now. So that's a sip of water through a fire hose. Sorry to go so fast, but that's the general outlines. And that's something, if you've seen something like this before, either for the Western Pacific or for Europe, please see me after my presentation because I can't find it out there. So, Scooter, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
We have a few moments for questions, and Dr. Herm will take questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really fascinating, and it was nice to see all the layers of detail that go in, and also kind of the broader strategic as well as the broader military thinking that goes with it. I wonder if you could say a few words about the importance of unmanned systems as force multipliers. Both, and we've been talking about, it's come up when we're talking about, for example, ISR, and talking about assets both in the air but also under the sea from an unmanned platforms. And if you could talk about how important and how valuable unmanned systems would be in order to build the kind of archipelagic defense that you're talking about,
unmanned,
both in terms of cost, lowering cost, but also in terms of getting together the massive forces you're going to need to do this kind of thing.
You're welcome to come sit.
Oh, okay. Why not? I think you've hit on an important point, Arthur. I think it's something that we're going to be driven towards for a variety of reasons. One is the cost of manpower. Even taking inflation into account, the cost per service member in our military has gone up over 50% since 9/11. It's gone up faster than the budget's gone up. So that squeezes out training, it squeezes out modernization. It basically puts our soldier, sailor, airmen, and Marines in a tough situation because they're not getting the equipment, they're not getting the training that they would otherwise get. So that's one problem. Second, so substituting capital for labor. Second is the rapid advances in artificial intelligence are stunning. And so the ability to incorporate more intelligence in these unmanned systems is becoming makes them increasingly attractive proposition. Third is the risk to certain systems. So I was talking to a senior admiral in our Navy, and this admiral's a submariner, and he said, I have told my admirals to focus on this question: is the follow-on class to the Virginia attack submarine sort of a better version of the Virginia class? Or is it going to be more like a submersible aircraft carrier? The aircraft carrier is the platform, but it launches a whole series, launches aircraft. Will the submarine launch a whole network of UUVs? And so they're focusing on issues like, okay, how do we power these things? How do we repower them? How do we communicate with them? The air question is a bit easier because the comms are easier, for example, and you can build them bigger. The one issue I have right now with where we're going there is there's this program the Navy has, the MQ-25, which is their unmanned tanker off the carrier. I think it has several major design flaws. I applaud the fact that they're looking at putting unmanned aircraft on a carrier, but I think they're going to end up hitting a dead end because of several design flaws. But if you look at the Japanese, they're even more manpower constrained than we are. I mean, you're just going to, because of technological breakthroughs, because of what you need to be able to do, because of the technology. I just think this is, and the question has become, okay, let's just take aircraft: long range, short range, stealthy, non-stealthy, manned, unmanned. I mean, it's that important an issue that it's worked into things like range and stealth.
Sir, thanks very much for your comments. It was very interesting. My name is John Paul, and I'm a marketing analyst for a defense and aerospace company. You showed Taiwan on the charts. You talked about it. And I was wondering, have you had a chance to talk to Taiwan authorities about this? And if you have, what was their reaction? And then also, if you have, there's some unique C2, because they're so isolated, bringing them into an integrated response, military response, would be challenging. And I was wondering if you just talk a little bit about Taiwan in this.
I haven't talked to the Taiwanese recently, and the number of Taiwanese I've talked to is a very small sample, more Australians and Japanese than. My sense is they're at a crossroads. Sort of the old way of maintaining a favorable balance against the Chinese is not working anymore. And so what's the new way? And I think partly they're looking at, well, okay, what are the Americans going to do? What are the Japanese going to do? Some of the Japanese I've talked to have said Taiwan is the anchor, our southern anchor. If our flank gets turned, it creates a whole, and I agree with them on that. Second thing is a colleague of mine, Jim Thomas, wrote a very interesting monograph called Hard Rock ROC 2.0, where he talks about creating the kind of indigenous resistance forces that I described in terms of the Filipinos, in terms of highly dispersed air defense, missile defense kinds of systems, coastal defense, as opposed to investing in, say, fairly expensive submarines. Getting back to Arthur's point, UUVs, proliferate those. And you're also getting to the point where mines are becoming so smart, it's hard to tell the difference between mines and UUVs. And so think about, proliferation of mines. So again, I think those are the kinds of issues that I've been hearing people talk about in terms of, okay, how do we address that problem? The other thing I should mention is we looked at not only how would we blockade China, but how would we break the Chinese blockade of Taiwan and Japan? Because you have to expect that to be going on as well. And that has multiple layers to it, not just a military, but an economic layer and then a positioning. But anyway, that's another interesting problem.
Sir?
Yeah, Andy, Robert Thomas. Sure. Thanks. You mentioned the INF Treaty and our ability to counterpunch and how we've essentially taken that away. What's your assessment as we go forward? Any enthusiasm for us finally relieving ourselves of that constraint and bringing back a intermediate range ballistic missile capability to provide for this archipelagic defense?
You picked up the word archipelagic a lot faster than I did. I have to say it every day to make sure I can still. But my understanding, somebody told me this, not for attribution, was in the Bush administration, said that the Russians had actually talked to us some years after we dropped out of the ABM treaty and said, you want to drop out of this because they're worried about the Chinese too. And the response was, we took the heat for the ABM treaty. You need to take the heat for the INF treaty. So that kind of got pushed aside because, again, we had this huge advantage. I think it'll be very interesting to see what the reaction is to the nuclear posture review, because that's going some, spots that, according to some segments of the political population, are taboo. If we can make some, and I think they're going in a positive direction, particularly with the different yields of nuclear weapons. If we can succeed there, I think, and also I think you'd have to make a case, a strong case, because of the barriers of the need to either, well, I would just as soon get out of the INF treaty, to be honest with you, and not call the Russians to account, but just get out of the treaty. And again, the Chinese enjoy some really significant advantages because they can play in that sandbox and we can't. And if you're talking about prompt engagement of distant targets, we don't have that right now. It takes a while even for a B-2 to get there, even for a cruise missile to get there. And again, that puts it at a disadvantage. I've asked my Japanese friends about, well, why don't you do some of this? And they said, don't bust my chops, that sort of thing.
Let Mikey eat it. Sir.
My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation's. Nuclear posture review is supposed to come out, I think, Friday, tomorrow. But last week sometime, the Huffington Post, they kind of
leaked it, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
No, I can't. I will tell you, working on one of the big things that strikes me, we do this nuclear posture review, we do a missile defense posture review. If you look at the way, let's just take the Chinese. The Chinese don't look at a nuclear review, or they look at a strategic posture review. And in that strategic posture review is command and control, early warning, cyber, precision conventional strike, that's capable of going after strategic targets, and nuclear forces. And they look at that, and they look at us that way. And so if we're going to put our hat on the deterrence rack, we need to start looking at this issue the way they do and understand how we can exploit their fears, but also make sure that they understand that the costs are always going to be higher than the gains.
Last question. I think we're running out of time in the back.
The speaker before you implied that the Chinese are very clever by advancing in small steps so that no step is worth committing weapons for. You are indicating that we probably might have the weapons. At one point is that tripwire where you're prepared to use them, according to what was said before, the Chinese are outsmarting us in that way.
Yeah, I would say that the Chinese have been outsmarting us. I served on the Defense Policy Board with Henry Kissinger, who at one point said the Chinese were the best strategists he had come up against. I figure that's a pretty high compliment. I think that one question I always expect to get is, okay, what about this gray area warfare? You're talking about deterring, nuclear war, conventional war. And one issue we have to look at, I think, is, okay, we've forgotten all about escalation dominance since the Cold War, once we had this enormous superiority. But think about gray area warfare. Okay, they do something, can we escalate? I mean, they're again, competing in areas, giant Coast Guard effort, for example. They're trying to fill areas where they can compete where we can't. And so there's a need to do that. I've kidded around a bit with my Japanese friends. I said, if you're really concerned about these islands, you need to make sure that if they want to take one, they have to kill somebody. They have to kill a Japanese citizen. And better if they kill a Japanese citizen and an American citizen, because then we're both in it together. But I don't think we've really thought through very well how, and right now some of this stuff is very cost imposing on the Japanese. So the Chinese send something out and the Japanese have to scramble jets or they have to scramble ships. That's an expensive proposition. And they've had to do that again and again, and they'll show you the bar graphs go up, up, up. And that's not a competition you want to be in. You have to figure out a way so that you're imposing costs on them. They're not imposing costs on you. But I take my hat off to the Chinese. They're playing a very good game.
Let's thank the doctor.
Good job. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry I couldn't answer your question.
So we've reached the end of our presenters. The schedule calls for some concluding remarks. I'm hesitant to do it because it's late and everyone wants to leave. So let me just sum up with just a few quick points. We started with the question that Dr. Herman put forward on what's at stake. And a primary purpose for putting this conference together was that here is an area where great powers are coming together, ships are bumping across each other, there are states that are losing territory, and Americans don't really seem to know exactly what this is all about. So it's an area that needs discussion. As was raised earlier, it's not even clear that we have a very firm grasp of all the issues and all the interests that America has at stake. Dr. Herman talked about energy and trade. Others talked about trade and alliances. Others talked about the need for the U.S. to have a forward posture in its traditional strategy of dominating key areas of the world. The admirals who spoke were eloquent on the military challenges, that what the Chinese are up to, what that would do to the complicated dynamics in the region. Professor Yoshihara was quite good on laying out the scope of the Chinese ambitions. It's much greater than the average Washington elite person is really sort of focusing on, and it has a very firm historic root, which adds to their fervor. Dr. Payne, I think, showed the limits of what the historical models might do and certain ways of thinking about it that might lead to a counter way of constructing a strategy. We had from very useful, I think, comment from the Admiral Thomas about this concept of accumulation of advantage, which is what the Chinese have been up to. And in this long-running game, as we've been talking about, and Dr. Tellis talked about the advantage to them of the ambiguity of what they're doing and also the ambiguity of what they're aiming for. But he also mentioned from Admiral Harris the loss of de facto control in the region. It's a stark statement made by a guy who I think is trying to get attention to the statement, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. Well, we're thinking about, given all those red lines that Dr. Herman put up in his chart. Finally, when we go back to where we began with Admiral Roughhead, who spoke about how important the notion of capacity is to go along with capability. That is to say, as the Soviets used to say, quantity has a quality all its own. And with the interior lines, with the closer proximity of where they are, with the seriousness of purpose, with the ambiguity on our side, that creates a very dynamic area where we have one hand behind our back and our attention is distracted. And I remember that Admiral Roughhead emphasizing to get at this problem how important the U.S.-Japan alliance is. We started with that. We ended with comments from Dr. Krepinevich along those same lines. And I think that's one of the important sub-themes from today. Thank you all for your patience. It's been a long 8 hours. I think we should have done this in 2 days, not one.